Drop the weapon. Put your hands where I can see them.
What weapon? This is my walking stick. I'm blind.
Don't play games with me. I know a club when I see one.
Sir, I have a white cane. I'm visually impaired.
Right, and I'm supposed to believe that?
He was walking along the sidewalk with the white cane in his hand, making the characteristic lateral movement that anyone who knows someone with a visual impairment immediately recognizes, that low and rhythmic arc that serves to map the space ahead and navigate the world without seeing it. It was a November afternoon. The sky was blue and clear over that busy commercial street, and there were people around coming and going in their own directions without anything in that scene suggesting any kind of problem. The man with the white cane was doing exactly what any person does on a public sidewalk on an ordinary afternoon. He was moving from one point to another with the assistance of the only instrument that made that movement possible for him. And then a police officer appeared in front of him, and the body camera that officer carried on his chest began recording something that, when it reached the right hands, would be impossible to defend. The body camera recorded everything from 3:27 in the afternoon on November 6th, 2024. It recorded the sidewalk, recorded the commercial establishments in the background, recorded the cars parked on the street, and recorded, with a clarity that left no room for any alternative interpretation, the white cane in the hand of the man being approached. That white cane was visible from the very first second of the recording. It did not appear later. It was not taken from somewhere during the interaction. It was there, in the camera's field of view, from the moment the officer got close enough that anyone with normal vision could identify it without any difficulty. And yet, what followed in the minutes after that first second was something that disability rights organizations, civil attorneys, and millions of people who watched the video in the weeks that followed described with the same words: incomprehensible. The man with the white cane was named James. He was 42 years old, had lost his vision gradually over a decade as the result of a degenerative medical condition, and had developed over that process the functional independence that visually impaired people build, with a combination of specific training, assistive technology, and the practical acceptance that the world was built for people who can see, and that navigating that world requires constant adaptation. He knew that street. He had walked that stretch dozens of times, knew how many steps there were between the bus stop and the entrance of the store he was going to visit, knew how the sidewalk changed texture at a certain corner, and carried the mental map of that neighborhood with the precision of someone who depends on spatial memory in a way that sighted people rarely need to develop. The officer who approached James that afternoon had been dispatched, according to the official account, that would be questioned in every detail in the weeks that followed, following a call reporting a man with suspicious behavior on that sidewalk. The description that had motivated the call, and that the officer had received over the radio before arriving at the scene, was vague enough to apply to any person within a radius of several blocks. But there was one element in the scene that made the suggestion of suspicious behavior not just unlikely, but actively absurd to anyone who arrived on that sidewalk with open eyes and no previously formed assumptions: the white cane. There was nothing ambiguous about that object. There was no second interpretation available. It was a white cane in the hands of a man in dark glasses on a public sidewalk, and it communicated with the precision of a universally recognized symbol that the person carrying it could not see. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. This story becomes progressively harder to believe as the details unfold, and you are going to want to follow it to the end, because the outcome says something important about what happens when evidence is clear enough to not be ignored. Hit subscribe right now and tell me in the comments, can you imagine being approached by a police officer for walking down the street with your own cane? Tell me down below. The video the body camera produced that November afternoon would become, in the weeks that followed, one of the most watched and most discussed recordings in the debate about abuse of authority and racial discrimination in the United States during that period. Not because it was the most violent case that had appeared in that debate, but because it contained a combination of elements that made it impossible to construct any defense that would not immediately collapse upon contact with the images: a black man, a white cane visible from the first second, and a police officer who had decided that none of those elements altered the course of action he had predetermined before arriving on the sidewalk. That combination, recorded in high definition with the date and time in the upper right corner of the screen, was what cost the officer everything he had built over years of service. James had left home that afternoon with a simple and specific goal: There was a musical instrument store 6 blocks from the apartment where he lived, and he had called that morning to confirm that the item he had ordered had arrived. The employee who answered had confirmed it, had given an estimated time when the store would be less busy, and James had planned his outing with the kind of advanced preparation that visually impaired people develop as a habit, because each independent trip requires a level of planning that goes beyond what most people need to consider. He knew the route, had checked on his phone's accessibility app whether there were any interruptions or construction along the way, had left with enough time not to need to quicken his pace, and had arrived on that commercial street without incident until the moment the officer appeared in front of him. The officer's name was Officer Brett Larson. He had 9 years of service in the department, had worked that commercial zone for 3 of the last 4 years, and knew that street with the familiarity of someone who had patrolled it in different shifts and weather conditions over hundreds of working days. That detail, that Larson knew that street, was relevant because it made even less sustainable any argument that he was unfamiliar with the kind of movement visually impaired people make on a public sidewalk, or that there was some characteristic of James's navigation with the cane that could legitimately seem suspicious to someone with patrol experience in that specific environment. There were visually impaired people who regularly frequented that commercial street. The white cane was not an unusual object in that context. It was simply a white cane. The call that had dispatched Larson had been made by a shopkeeper whose establishment was half a block from where James was when the officer arrived. The shopkeeper had described a black man walking erratically on the sidewalk and potentially disturbing customers. That description would later be contested by at least 4 people who were on the street at that moment and who would give statements confirming that James had walked along the sidewalk without disturbing anyone, without approaching any establishment beyond the one he was going to visit, and without any behavior that could reasonably be described as erratic by any objective standard. Navigation with a white cane has a specific appearance that can look different from the walking pattern of a sighted person, but that any basic training in interacting with people with disabilities teaches you to immediately recognize. What the shopkeeper had described as erratic was simply the way James walked. Larson arrived at the scene and saw James walking on the sidewalk with the cane. The body camera captured that moment with a clarity that would make that first second of the recording the most analyzed of the entire video in the weeks that followed, because it was the moment that it established what Larson had seen before, saying or doing anything. The cane was visible. The characteristic movement with it was visible. The dark glasses James was wearing, which in combination with the white cane, composed an image whose interpretation should not have required any deductive effort, were visible. Larson stopped James and began asking questions in the tone the camera captured as the tone of someone who arrived with a conclusion and is collecting information to support it, not to evaluate it. That distinction between investigating and confirming what has already been decided was audible in every question Larson asked in those first minutes. James responded with the calm of someone who has been caught off guard, but who has enough experience with the world to quickly understand the nature of what is happening. He identified himself, explained where he was going, mentioned the musical instrument store and the item he had ordered. He held the white cane in a way the camera showed clearly, not because he was trying to use it as proof of something, but simply because it was what he was carrying and what he needed to continue walking when that conversation ended. Larson looked at the cane. The camera recorded that look. And then Larson did something that none of the people who watched the video afterward could explain with any logic that held up. He asked James to put the cane on the ground. That request that a blind man place on the ground, the only instrument that allowed him to navigate independently in that space, was the moment the recording became something that transcended the specific case of James and Larson and became a document of something broader and more disturbing. It was not merely a misjudgment. It was not merely a poorly conducted approach. It was a request that only made sense if the person who made it had decided, at some level, the camera could not record, but that the actions made inferable, that no visible element in that scene altered. The narrative he had brought with him to that sidewalk. The white cane was there. The request was made anyway. And James, who could not see Larson's expression, but who could hear every word and every tone with the auditory acuity developed through years of sensory compensation, understood in that moment that the conversation he was having had nothing to do with anything he had done. James did not put the cane on the ground. He explained, with a patience the camera captured, and that anyone watching the video would recognize as the exhausting kind of patience that develops when you spend years having to explain the existence of your own disability to people who should know but do not. That the cane was a mobility instrument, and that putting it on the ground was not something he could do without compromising his ability to remain oriented in that space. He said this directly and without aggression, the way someone explains something they consider obvious but is willing to articulate once because the situation demands it. Larson heard the explanation and made the request again. The camera recorded that sequence, James's explanation and Larson's repetition of the request, with a clarity that made it impossible to argue afterward that there had been some communication failure or misunderstanding about what was being said by each party. What Larson did next was the moment that would become the center of all subsequent coverage of the case, and that would be reproduced billions of times on digital platforms in the weeks that followed. He reached for James's cane, did not ask again, did not wait. He extended his hand and attempted to remove the cane from James's hands, who instinctively held it more firmly, because removing the cane from a blind person's hands in a public space removes their capacity for independent orientation. And anyone who spends a day training mobility with visual impairment understands this in a way that someone who has never experienced it cannot completely imagine. James held onto the cane. Larson interpreted that as resistance, and the camera captured every second of that sequence with a fidelity that left no room for any alternative narrative about what had happened. The situation escalated in a period of time. The camera's timestamp would record as less than 90 seconds between the first request to put the cane on the ground and the moment Larson called for backup over the radio. The backup call was described over the radio as a resistant individual who was refusing to comply with orders and who might represent a risk to public safety. That description, which reached the ears of every agent who responded to the call before they arrived at the scene, was the same dynamic that had appeared in other cases examined on this channel. The narrative transmitted over the radio defined how every person who arrived would process what they found, regardless of what was actually happening at the location. What was actually happening was a blind man holding his own cane on a public sidewalk. What would reach the ears of the backup agents was a description of danger. 3 people who were on the sidewalk at that moment stopped when they saw what was happening. 2 of them took out their phones and began recording. That decision, made independently by 2 strangers who did not know each other, but who simultaneously recognized that they were witnessing something that needed to be documented, produced 2 additional angles of the same scene that would complement Larson's body camera in ways his legal team had certainly not anticipated when the situation began. One of the recordings captured the scene from a lateral angle that clearly showed the white cane standing out against the gray sidewalk, making it even more impossible to argue that the object was not immediately identifiable. The other recorded from a slightly elevated angle that showed James's expression throughout the interaction, an expression that anyone watching would describe as the expression of someone processing the reality of a situation that should not be happening but is. Backup arrived in 4 minutes. 2 additional agents who had received Larson's radio description and who arrived with the posture of people informed that there was active resistance. When they saw the scene, when their own eyes did the work that Larson's body camera had already done 4 minutes earlier, something should have changed. The white cane was visible to them in the same way it had been visible to Larson. James's dark glasses were visible. The nature of the situation was visible. One of the backup agents, whose name was not released during the initial investigation, but who was identified later, paused when he arrived at the scene in a hesitation the camera on his chest recorded as perhaps 3 seconds long. 3 seconds during which he assessed what he was seeing with his own eyes before the group dynamic and the narrative he had received over the radio took over. He did not intervene. He followed the implicit protocol of supporting the colleague who had initiated the approach. That decision not to intervene, when there was clear reason to question what was happening, would become a separate element of the subsequent investigation. James was detained on that sidewalk. He was guided by the arms by 2 agents to the patrol car with the white cane being carried separately by Larson as though it were a seized object, which produced in the body camera an image that would be described by disability rights specialists as one of the most disturbing representations of institutional abuse they had seen documented on video, because the separation between James and his cane was not merely symbolic, it was functional. It was the removal of a blind person's capacity for independent orientation, executed by a state agent in a public space recorded on body camera and impossible to frame as anything other than what it was. James was detained for 48 minutes. That number, which the body camera and the department's dispatch records documented with precision, would become one of the most cited details when the case gained public attention, because it represented 48 minutes during which a blind man was separated from the cane that was his primary mobility instrument in a patrol car, with no charge that held up and no explanation that made sense to anyone who had watched the first seconds of the recording. During that time, the musical instrument store where James was supposed to have arrived in the early afternoon was open. The employee who had confirmed the order that morning was waiting, and the item James had ordered was on the counter. None of those circumstances had changed. What had changed was that James was in a patrol car instead of covering the last blocks of the route he had planned so carefully that morning. The release process began when a supervisor arrived at the scene and assessed the situation with her own eyes. The supervisor was Sergeant Patricia Howell, with 18 years of service, and she had arrived not in response to Larson's backup call, but because her patrol route that afternoon passed through that commercial street and she had seen the patrol car stopped with lights on and 2 agents on the sidewalk. When Howell approached and was briefed on the situation by Larson, she immediately requested access to the body camera to review what had been recorded. That review lasted less than 3 minutes. When it ended, Howell instructed Larson to release James immediately, return the cane, and document the incident completely. Larson's expression during that instruction was captured on Howell's body camera, which she had activated upon arriving at the scene per standard protocol, and it was the expression of someone who had not yet fully processed why the situation was being ended the way it was being ended. James was released with the cane returned, and with no formal explanation of what had justified the detention in the first place. Howell approached him after Larson had stepped away and attempted to offer an explanation the camera captured as a genuine attempt to do something that protocol had not prepared her to do in that specific situation. She said there had been a misunderstanding, that she was sorry for the inconvenience, and that James was free to continue on his way. James listened to that in silence for a moment. Then he asked a question that Howell had not anticipated and that the camera captured with audio clear enough to be transcribed afterward. He asked for the name and identification number of every agent who had participated in the detention. It was not an aggressive question. It was a question asked with the precise calm of someone who had decided, during those 48 minutes in the patrol car, what they were going to do when they got out of it. Howell provided the information. James recorded it on his phone using the voice system he used to type, a system the camera captured functioning while James held the phone in a specific way. Another visual detail that anyone watching the video would recognize as yet another confirmation that they were looking at a visually impaired person using assistive technology. That moment, James recording the agents' names and numbers through the voice system while Howell watched had an almost documentary quality that several legal commentators would note when the video became public. It was the moment the situation turned, when the person who had been treated as a suspect was clearly taking the steps that would transform that afternoon into something with permanent consequences for the people involved. The 2 recordings made by bystanders on the sidewalk had continued during part of the detention and continued during the release. One of them captured the moment the cane was returned to James, and that specific moment would become perhaps the most shared image of the entire case in the weeks that followed, because it contained a visual economy that communicated everything that needed to be communicated without any additional narration. The cane returning to James's hands, his posture shifting slightly as his fingers wrapped around the familiar handle. The reorientation movement he made immediately afterward, the low rhythmic arc beginning again, mapping the surrounding space after 48 minutes without that information. Anyone watching that moment understood, viscerally and immediately, what had been removed and what had been returned, and understood also, with the same immediacy, what could never be completely returned. The musical instrument store was closed when James arrived there 22 minutes after being released. He had called while walking the final blocks, but the employee who had answered that morning had finished his shift, and whoever was now answering had not been informed of the order. James stood on the sidewalk in front of the store for a few minutes, cane in hand, processing the end of an afternoon that had begun with a planned route and an item waiting on the counter. He had not gotten what he had left home to find. He had lost 48 minutes that could not be recovered, and he had in hand the names and identification numbers of the agents who had made that afternoon what it had been. The store would be open the next day. The process he was about to begin would take longer than that. But James had learned over a decade of adapting to a progressive disability that the time necessary to do the right things rarely corresponds to the time you had planned to use. The video reached social media 48 hours after the incident. One of the two bystanders who had recorded the scene on the sidewalk had hesitated before publishing, not for lack of conviction about what he had documented, but because he had spent those 48 hours trying to decide whether there was any way for that recording to exist in the public space without the unpredictable consequences that videos of that kind sometimes produce. He had watched what he had recorded dozens of times, had shown it to people close to him, had received back the same assessment he had arrived at alone, that what was in that video needed to be seen. He published on a Saturday afternoon with a simple caption that described what had happened without editorializing, without inflaming, just the facts in sequence. The video was 93 seconds long. In 12 hours, it had 2 million views. The speed with which that video spread said something about what it contained that resonated, immediately and across very different audiences. It was not only the outrage at James's treatment, although that outrage was real and intense. It was the white cane. It was the specificity of that symbol and the absolute clarity of what it communicated, and the contrast between that clarity and what the officer had done anyway. People who had no direct experience with visual impairment understood what a white cane meant. People who had direct experience, either as visually impaired people or as family members, saw in the video something that went beyond that specific incident and that touched on a kind of vulnerability that existed at the intersection of disability and race in a way that had rarely been documented with such clarity. Disability rights organizations were the first to issue formal statements, and they came with a technical specificity that complemented the emotional reaction of the general audience. Those organizations described what Larson had done in precise legal terms, citing specific violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which prohibits discrimination based on disability by public agents and establishes very clear obligations about how government institutions must interact with people with disabilities in public spaces. They pointed out that removing or attempting to remove a mobility instrument from a person with a disability without legal justification is a documentable violation of that legislation that exists independently of any other allegation of abuse of authority or racial discrimination. James's case was not only a case of discriminatory policing, it was also a case of violation of federally protected rights of a specific category that created an additional legal pathway with its own liability structure. Civil rights organizations joined the statements in the following 24 hours, and the combination of the two fronts created pressure on the department that was qualitatively different from the pressure that individual cases of police abuse normally generate. Because there were two different sets of federal legislation being invoked simultaneously, and the department needed to respond to both in a way that did not create contradiction between the responses. Any statement that tried to minimize the racial issue compromised the response to the disability issue, and vice versa. And any attempt to argue that Larson had acted in good faith or within the limits of operational discretion collided with the fact that the body camera showed the white cane from the first second, which made any argument about insufficient information impossible to sustain. The department issued a statement 48 hours after the video had gone viral. It was the kind of statement departments issue when they need to say something, but are not ready to say what they need to say, full of language about institutional values and commitment to fair and transparent investigation, with no specific acknowledgement of what the recording showed and no mention of the white cane that was at the center of everything. That statement was received with a reaction the department had probably not anticipated in its extent. It was read as evidence that the institution had not yet made the most basic assessment of what was recorded on its own agent's body camera, because anyone who had made that assessment could not produce that statement without mentioning the cane. The statement generated more negative reaction than silence would have generated, which was a clear indicator that the communication strategy had failed before it was even fully executed. James had retained a law firm specializing in civil rights and disability rights 3 days after the incident, before the video went viral, but after doing enough research to identify who had experience in both fields simultaneously. When the video became public and the pressure on the department began accumulating in a way that anyone following the case could, measure, James's attorneys had contacted the department through the appropriate formal channels, informing them that a lawsuit was being prepared, and that any destruction, editing, or loss of evidence material, including all body camera recordings of the incident, would be treated as obstruction with all applicable legal consequences. That notification had reached the department before the public statement, which meant that when the statement was issued, the department already knew a lawsuit was coming, and that the recordings were being preserved by legal obligation. The vague statement they had issued in that context communicated even more clearly than it would have under normal circumstances that the institution had not yet decided how to deal with what it knew was recorded. Larson was placed on paid administrative leave the week after the video went viral, which was technically an administrative measure and not a punishment, but which the department had learned from the public reaction to its previous statements needed to be announced with language that acknowledged the gravity of what had happened, rather than framing it as routine procedure. The announcement of the suspension explicitly mentioned the body camera and what it had documented, which was a significant change from the initial statement that had avoided mentioning the white cane. That shift in language between the first statement and the suspension announcement was, for anyone who had followed the case from the beginning, a clear indicator that the department had finally watched the video through the eyes of someone who needed to respond publicly for what was in it, and had understood that the distance between the vague language of the first statement and the reality of the recording was unsustainable. The internal investigation was conducted over 6 weeks by a group that included, at the insistence of James's firm, as a condition for not accelerating the federal lawsuit immediately, an independent external reviewer with no ties to the department. That condition had been negotiated in the first days after Larson's suspension, when the department had made contact with James's attorneys signaling interest in resolution before formal proceedings. James's attorneys had agreed to keep the lawsuit in preparation rather than filing it immediately, but only under specific conditions that included the external reviewer, complete access to all recordings, including the backup agent's cameras, and access to Larson's complete complaint history over the previous 9 years. The department had agreed to all 3 conditions, which was itself an indicator of the internal assessment they had made about the strength of their position. Larson's complaint history revealed during the investigation had 4 entries prior to the incident with James. 2 had been filed after summary investigation, with no substantive details in the record. 1 had resulted in mandatory additional training that the records showed had been completed on paper, but with no verification that it had produced any documentable behavioral change. The 4th, which had occurred 18 months before the incident with James, involved an approach to a person with a hearing impairment that had been described by the complainant as disrespectful, and based on incorrect assumptions about the person's behavior, and had been filed with a note that the agent had received verbal guidance. That 4th complaint was the most relevant to James's lawsuit because it established that the department had previously been informed that Larson had a specific pattern of difficulty in interactions with people with disabilities and had responded with verbal guidance rather than substantive intervention. What had happened with James was, in his attorney's reading, the direct and foreseeable consequence of that institutional choice. The lawsuit was filed in federal court 8 weeks after the incident, naming Larson individually, the backup agent who had hesitated and not intervened, and the department as an institution. The central allegations covered violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, civil rights violations with documentable racial motivation, and institutional supervisory negligence established by the complaint history that had been systematically ignored. The amount sought was not disclosed at the time of filing by strategic choice of James's attorneys, who had learned in prior cases that announcing specific amounts before the process develops frequently frames the public narrative in a way that benefits the opposing party more than the client. What was disclosed were the non-financial conditions that James had determined were non-negotiable from the first day, Larson's. Dismissal without possibility of rehire in any law enforcement capacity, complete revision of protocols for interacting with people with disabilities throughout the department, and verifiable mandatory training that could not be completed on paper alone. Larson was dismissed 4 months after the incident, after the internal investigation concluded that he had violated multiple departmental protocols and that the complaint history made it impossible to treat the incident as an isolated deviation. The police union filed an appeal that was denied on second review, after the external reviewer confirmed the internal investigation's findings and added his own analysis that the white cane had been visible from the first second of the body camera and that no standard training in any department in the country could be interpreted as authorizing the approach that had been made. That specific language from the external reviewer, that no standard training authorized what had been done, closed the path to any operational discretion argument the union might have attempted to construct in a higher instance. James received the item he had ordered at the musical instrument store 3 days after being released on that sidewalk, during a visit the store had arranged outside normal business hours after the employee who had answered the call that morning learned what had happened. That visit was not on any recording and was not part of any legal record. It was simply a man walking into a store with his cane and leaving with what he had gone to find. The agreement that closed the federal lawsuit was signed 6 months after the incident. The financial amount remained confidential. The institutional conditions were made public at James's insistence, who had argued that the only outcome that justified the time and energy invested was an outcome that existed as a verifiable record beyond that specific case. Larson had lost his career, the department had changed its protocols, and James had returned to that commercial street some weeks after the agreement was signed, had covered the same route he had planned on that November morning, had entered the musical instrument store for the second time, and had left with his cane in hand navigating the sidewalk with the same low rhythmic arc that anyone who saw him would immediately recognize for what it was. The same movement that had been visible on the body camera from the very first second. The movement that should never have been enough for anything other than letting him pass.